Esi, welcome to London, first of all, and welcome to Waterstones.
I'm delighted to be here.
Let's have a little look at the book, actually, because apart from being a brilliant novel, it is also a gorgeous object with this gold foil. It's got these beautiful green end papers here. As an author, do you do a little dance when you see that your publisher's made a gorgeous package like this?
You do, because it doesn't always occur. But this was the very first design that Pete Dyer at Serpent's Tail came up with, and I just thought he absolutely clinched it. It's perfect. It very much expresses the essence of the book, and it's very gorgeous.
It's a delight to read as well. Quite a difficult read in places, of course, because we start off in Barbados on a plantation and we meet Washington Black, who is an 11-year-old boy there. He's a slave boy, and we are thrown straight into this world of the slaves, and you don't pull any punches. We really feel how awful that life is for people. You actually began writing the book inspired by the case of the Tichborne claimant, is that right? And then obviously you've sort of drifted away from that story to tell your own. How quickly did that happen in the writing process?
It happened very early on. Within that first draft, I could already feel myself kind of straining away from all of the strange machinations of the trials, which went on for over 20 years of litigation. And it was difficult to know how to enter that story, and then I found I just wasn't as interested in that as I was interested in the psychology of a boy who's taken from a very brutal life and into an utterly different world culturally. That was my focus.
He is quite literally plucked, isn't he, from the fields. He's given, I suppose, in a way to this character Titch, who uses him as an assistant in his scientific work. Washington turns out to be brilliant at sketching and drawing, becomes a useful artist, and then there is an escape. He leaves this island and goes out into the world. This juxtaposition, I suppose, of slave life and freedom in the world is so marked. Was that always something that you wanted to explore with that character of Wash?
It was something that wasn't there at the outset of the novel. Because I was focusing so much on the Tichborne claimant affair, but it really emerged when I started to have to rein in. I had so much material, and I really had to ask myself the question: what is this book about? And the book is about freedom. So it's about that passage from being enslaved to being a free man in the world. But Washington really realizes that, even though he's free in body, he's physically free, that he's not necessarily emotionally and psychologically free. So it's about him having to really reshape his notions of what freedom is, which at the outset of the novel are very, very basic, and then try to, in some measure, achieve that, even though he's very traumatized. And he has to kind of work his way towards that.
That idea of trauma in freedom is really important. I was reminded, weirdly I suppose, of Black Boy by Richard Wright, and he describes brilliantly the trauma of just everyday life, everyday interaction for a black man in America in that case. And I felt it again reading this book, where he's never safe, and that has a psychological toll on him, doesn't it?
Yeah, it very much does. It's a case of he feels that beyond the borders of the plantation, that it's a life of freedom, and this is what he's been told by Big Kit, who's his protector at the outset of the novel. And so going into the world, I think he's at first quite shocked to discover that physically being a black man and being a disfigured black man, that these are huge physical barriers. That he will never be able to get beyond this. And I think that that's a really hard truth for him to absorb. And I'm not really sure that he ever is able to make peace with that, even by the end of the novel.
There is this idea of guilt as well, isn't there? He feels guilt at having, I suppose, survived his life as a slave. And there's also the question of whether Titch, this man who had care of him, feels any guilt about what he has done. Why is guilt such a powerful emotion, I suppose, for the survivors of this terrible thing when you think that wouldn't be the problem, but that is something that he carries, isn't it?
It definitely is something that he carries, and I love that observation. There's that scene where they're traveling to Norfolk, and he's in the carriage with Titch, and this is after he's been assaulted in the streets of Norfolk, and he recognizes that his safety lays in Titch. Like, without Titch, he's completely unsafe in this land. But he has that measure of safety in this man. And then they pass a field, and he can see people like him, picking cotton, and he has that strong reaction of guilt, because he understands that, that was his life, until he was just for mysterious reasons beyond his knowing that he was just randomly selected. And I think there is a lot of guilt in that, if you are the one who has survived through no no efforts of your own, that this is an act of fate, that things could have easily turned out the other way. I think that is something that, that one would carry some guilt over. And so part of his process of working through what it means to have been a slave is, a huge part of that is guilt in having been able to leave that life behind. That's part of what he's processing.
You write, I suppose, what could be called historical fiction, because it's set in periods in the past. But it has an immediacy to it which made me think of things that are happening in the world now. And I wondered whether you had those things in your mind when you were writing the book. I'm thinking in particular of seeing a lot of videos coming out of America at the moment, for example, where black people are being questioned. Their freedom is being questioned, often by white people. When they're suspected of not living in an apartment block, or not having access to a swimming pool or something like that by somebody else who lives there. And we're about to see the release of the film of The Hate U Give, which is of course all about black people being treated differently in American society. Even though this is set many, many years ago, I wondered whether there is still a huge amount of work still to be done for black people to feel safe in everyday life, even in very advanced Western societies. Would you agree with that?
I would very much agree with that. There's still so much work to be done, and in fact, I think in these last 2 years we've regressed in a lot of the the strides forward that had been achieved. So there's just so much work to be done, and it's almost daunting to think of how one can begin to do that work and to make those efforts. And I take solace in this fact, but perhaps it's not right. But in writing a novel like Washington Black, I think the desire of most fiction writers, but you really want people to read the story of this young boy, and it's set in 1830s, and he's this small young man who's disfigured. But if people who are utterly unlike him can read the novel and feel some measure of connection with him, and see maybe how see a part of themselves in him, and see how maybe they share some of his estrangement, or at least feel some empathy for him. I think that to me is the beginning of trying to restore a general empathy in society. I think that's what's lacking now, is we're not really interested in hearing each other's ideas or points of view, and we're not really listening, I think, across these large chasms of, it's just all about disagreement and discord and privileging some lives over other lives, and saying that these people are more worthy than and it's just I feel, at least as a fiction writer, and like I said, maybe I'm fooling myself, but it's my part of my I don't want to say my job, but my project, I guess, is to try and get people to see the humanity of figures who maybe are just so wildly different from who they are.
Esi, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you for coming in to tell us a bit more about it today.
No, thank you so much.